Our story today begins with a love song from Isaiah chapter 5, and it's easy to forget it's a love song by the time you get to the end of the story with all of its trampling and desolation, its devouring. But this oracle of doom starts with a love song. The owner of the vineyard puts love and care and back-breaking labor into this vineyard, digging and clearing fields, investing in choice vines. The infrastructure needed to make wine are all signs of an owner's love and of his hope for a future with prosperity. We're mindful of our neighbors in wine country here who did the same thing and are now looking at the ruins of burned fields. Our prayers are with them, because as this story reminds us, it is a lot of work. And in Isaiah's story, they're not building a garden just of pretty flowers, which is nice. This is a vineyard that will bear fruit so that people can eat, so that people can drink. It's not just for the benefit of the gardener, it is for the benefit of the community. And those of you who garden and farm know that the harvest is too much to only benefit one person. An abundant harvest benefits others. Well-tended vineyards and gardens are illustrations of abundance, of how you live when your cup is runnething over. The owner of the vineyard has done everything he can do to be assured that the vineyard will be a blessing. And as evidenced by the wild, bitter grapes, there is clearly only so much he can do to affect the harvest. What else, he asks, was there for him to do that he has not already done? Somehow the vineyard doesn't produce good grapes as it should, and there is no abundant harvest. And this makes no sense to us, because good champagne grapevines can't just decide to disobey the gardener and grow into wild, bitter grapes. And why would they when they could be champagne? Of course, this story isn't about grapes. It's about us. For the vineyard of the Lord is the house of Israel, and the people of Judah are God's pleasant planting. This is a story about us. We who have been created in love and put on this earth to be an abundant harvest of good things for the world, we choose instead to be bad grapes. Much like the grapes in the story, it just doesn't make sense. Why don't we, as humans, created in love by God, live our lives as blessings to the world? Love's labor is lost when we don't. Before this story was about you and I, it was being told about Israel, and God's expectation for all the care and provision God had given Israel was for Israel, God's pleasant planting, to share the abundance of their harvest. A harvest of righteousness and justice. These two words function together in the Hebrew scriptures to remind us of a society in which the rights of all, including the most marginalized, are protected. This is God's reasonable expectation given the divine provision. But this love song has gone terribly awry. Justice and righteousness were not what the people experienced. He looked for justice and saw bloodshed. He listened for righteousness, but heard a cry of oppression. That's another translation of verse 7. As my friend and colleague Stacy Simpson Duke wrote, Isaiah's words picture what happens when a people refuse the care and nurture lavished on them, or when they accept it, but keep it only to themselves. Isaiah is telling Israel that the people can continue to live for themselves instead of pursuing justice and righteousness. And if they do, God will leave them to it. And I worry about that tendency of ours to desire and want security for ourselves, but to refuse to help others obtain it. People say they want law and order, but when people protest for laws to be fair and justice to be equal, they call them rioters. Many of our ancestors came here from other countries, often fleeing violence and danger and famine and oppression. And when people try that today, we put them in detention centers and we take away their children. Listen again to the middle verse of our love song. And now I will tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge, and it shall be devoured. I will break down its wall, and it shall be trampled down. I will make it a waste. Israel had been carted off into exile by this point in their history, and they had seen Isaiah's words come true. They knew what it meant to live through the devastation described. And Isaiah calls on them to acknowledge their role and to move toward a better relationship with the God who loves them, who created them, who blessed them, who planted and watered them. Isaiah leaves his audience, and Isaiah leaves us with this question: what kind of fruit are we producing? Righteousness and justice, or bloodshed and oppression? The story we read today in Matthew also suggests that Jesus was asking similar questions in the temple that Isaiah had been asking. As the religious leaders ask Jesus about authority, he answers their question with a whole different premise. Using the Isaiah text to start his parable, he begins, "Listen to another parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard, put a fence around it, dug a winepress in it, and built a watchtower." Sound familiar? You can almost see the audience acting like eager schoolchildren around him, wanting to impress their teacher. "Oh, pick me, I know this one. It's from Isaiah. We're supposed to be good grapes, not nasty wild grapes." But then Jesus' story changes, as Jesus' stories are wont to do. God, the owner of the vineyard, turns into an absentee landlord. All of the hands come down. "Never mind, I thought I knew where he was going with this story," they think to themselves. "But why would God be a landlord? All the peasants I know who work for a landlord all the livelong day, they don't have one good thing to say about them. Landlords take every penny earned, and the peasants have nothing to show for it. Why would he equate God to a landlord?" Jesus is okay with our discomfort when God does not behave as we think God ought to behave. And so Jesus goes on with his adapted vineyard story. Landlord sends slaves to collect the harvest. Slaves are killed. He sends more slaves. They're also killed. Then the landlord sends his only begotten son. Why does that sound familiar? Oh, right, Jesus. Now, the story takes an even bigger twist because the tenants decide that by killing the heir, they will become the new heirs. Now, you know that never works out anywhere. That's not in any economic system we know of. But the tenants on this vineyard are all operating under this false premise. This land is not theirs. This harvest is not theirs. The labor is not even theirs. And Jesus, like Isaiah, calls the priests in the temple to pronounce justice on themselves. Now, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do with those tenants? Well, he'll put those wretches to a miserable death and lease the vineyard to other tenants who will give him the produce at harvest time. And their answer is mostly correct. Their answer acknowledges that the next people on the land will also not be the heirs. The mistaken assumption of the wicked tenants that they could kill the heir and then inherit, that's done away with. And I think they're correct that the new tenants on the land will turn over the harvest produce at harvest time, because I think this is where Jesus is answering their original question about authority. "You can talk to me about authority all day long," says Jesus, "but let's talk about your obedience to God's authority. You walk around this temple as if you own the place. Who made you the heir?" And then Jesus starts quoting scriptures. "Have you never read the scriptures?" he says to people who read the scriptures professionally. This is angry Jesus. "The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, and therefore I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people that produces the fruits of the kingdom." Jesus goes on to say, "The one who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, and it will crush anyone on whom it falls." So I wonder, who's the one? In previous readings, I had always figured that if Jesus was the cornerstone, then the ones who got crushed would be the wretches. And maybe that's it. But this week, as I was thinking about World Communion and that we're about to celebrate, and it occurred to me that this life-giving meal is available to us because Jesus, in dying on a cross, was broken. "This is my body, broken for you," he says. What more was there to do for God's vineyard than God had already done? Death was crushed under a stone that rolled away from a tomb, leading to new life. So I wonder if God's mysterious justice means that the wretches aren't the ones who suffer a miserable death after all. Perhaps Jesus' parable, like Isaiah's, is a love song. In both stories, in Isaiah and in Matthew, it can be hard to see the love song in the midst of the trampling and crushing and anger. But then I look around at our world, where so much seems to be going wrong, and I get it. I love our country, and I'm furious about the ways we harvest injustice and bloodshed instead of growing a crop of justice and righteousness. I want to tear down the vines that are yielding white supremacy and extreme income inequality and violence so that we can plant new vines and yield better harvests to the benefit of everyone. Can you see the photos of people protesting in our streets and notice the love that's underneath the anger? The love can be hard to see, but in truth, you don't give up a comfortable day on the couch to go march in a crowd for something that doesn't matter to you deeply. Sometimes a love song might require drastic action and protesting in the streets. Sometimes a love song requires speaking difficult truth to your beloved so the relationship can be stronger and healthier. Are we singing a love song with our lives, here with our congregation, here in our country? Are we producing fruits of the kingdom, and are we speaking up for justice? Are we leading people to know God's love in the things we do and say? We are beginning our stewardship campaign this month, and while it is a part of creating our budget for 2021, stewardship is not primarily about money. It is about producing fruits of the kingdom. Are we using our resources, financial and otherwise, to till the soil of peace, to plant seeds of truth, to reap a harvest of justice to benefit all of God's children? We invite you to be prayerfully in discernment about how you can contribute to that here, this next year. And this week, I also invite you to listen for the love song in the anger you feel, in the despair and frustration. I invite you to look for signs of the fruit of the kingdom in our own lives. We will gather around God's table in a few minutes, and the grapes at God's table are good grapes, and we have been invited to join and benefit from the harvest. Like the vineyard, this table won't belong to us. It is the Lord's table where God's love for us is on great display. And due to the mysterious justice and grace of God, we too have been invited to the feast and invited to join the chorus of God's love song. Thanks be to God. Amen.